Good morning. How's everyone doing? Ready to go? Got your coffee? All right. Well, I'm Stephen Watson, and it's my honor to serve here at the National World War II Museum as the President and CEO. And I want to thank you all for joining us today for what I know is going to be an engaging and informative symposium. I hope some of you had a chance to attend last night's opening keynote lecture by Colonel Edna Cummings. Colonel Cummings, I know you're here somewhere, getting her tea. Sorry, I didn't mean to call you out getting your tea, but thank you for kicking off our programming with really such an important presentation highlighting the 688 and really the legacy of African American women that served in World War II. So thank you for a wonderful start. And before we get into today's program, I want to honor the tradition we have here at the National World War II Museum by recognizing some special guests that are either here in our audience in New Orleans or for those that are joining us online. And of course, those are our nation's World War II veterans, Holocaust survivors, and homefront workers. So let's give them a round of applause. We are here to honor them every single day. And also to our service members of any era, please stand or wave to be recognized for your service to our country. And I think that also among that number includes a noted author and speaker at our last International World War II conference, General Mary Eder. Is General Eder here with us this morning? Yeah, right there. Thank you, General. Been a great friend to the museum. We were talking last night, I guess 7 or 8 years ago, we first had the chance to meet here on campus. And finally, I want to acknowledge and thank those of you who support our museum, our charter members, our Patriot Circle members, as well as all of our program, education, and capital campaign donors. Thank you for your support of our institution. It's what makes today possible. So last Veterans Day, we opened one of our most significant and ambitious special exhibits, Our War II Women in Service. This is really a groundbreaking exhibition, probably the first of its kind produced anywhere in the country, that honors the 350,000 American women who answered the call to serve our country during World War II. And of course, this exhibit explores their accomplishments and how that continues to impact our world, something that Colonel Cummings talked about last night in her presentation. So today's program will build on those themes, and I hope some of you, while you're here today, if you have not already, will take some time to visit the exhibit. It really is extraordinary. It took a lot of work from a lot of people. Many of those folks are in this room. I'm looking at our Director of Exhibits, Tom Schertz, and his team who worked on this terrific group of advisors that we pulled together, the best of the best in terms of scholars from across the country. But one person in particular that I want to recognize is our Senior Curator and Director of Curatorial Affairs, Kim Geis, who was the lead curator on this exhibit. And Kim has been here, gosh, more than 15 years, and I know that this exhibit, although was a concentrated effort in the last 18 months to pull it all together, but really represents, I think, 2 decades worth of work, collecting the material, highlighting this story, and really it's just come together beautifully in this exhibit. So thank you, Kim, for a remarkable job. And you'll get to hear all about that at lunchtime today when Kim will talk about the exhibit and I think really the process of developing and collecting, which is so important to being able to present it to the public. So one other point I want to make is we're proud to have Our War II here on our campus, but we're equally proud that it will, when it leaves New Orleans, will go on a 3-year tour and we'll travel the country to every corner of this country in major museums and major markets. So the legacy of this exhibit, the impact, won't end when its run ends here in New Orleans later this year. So at the very beginning of this process, and we set out to do this, we went to a very important person in our community and said, we have this great idea, we have this important exhibit that we want to develop, can you help us? And that was Gail Benson and the Gail and Tom Benson Charitable Foundation. And we got an immediate positive response, and they said, we're all in. We want to help you make this happen. And really, we were extremely grateful for that, but we were not surprised because Gail Benson and her late husband, Tom, have been supporting this museum going back to the very beginning when we were the National D-Day Museum. Some of you may not know that Mr. Benson was a World War II veteran himself. He served aboard the USS South Dakota in the Pacific, and I had a chance to visit with him many years ago. I was just mentioning this to Mrs. Benson. And like many World War II veterans, was extremely proud of his service, but even more so humble, and never wanted to draw attention to himself or his role. He felt that he was just doing his part like everybody else. So we were privileged to have him involved with our museum from the very beginning as a trustee at the founding of the D-Day Museum. In the early phases of our development, he was there with us. So of course, the Gail and Tom Benson Charitable Foundation have done so much for our community. They have, of course, brought a Super Bowl to New Orleans that we're all extremely grateful for. And Mrs. Benson, this is not in my notes, but something we're also very proud of here at the museum is we believe we had a small part in that because we hosted the team party in this room in 2009 before you all headed off to Florida. So we take a little bit of credit for creating a positive spirit that year. But when I say that I think no one has done more for our community than Gail Benson and their foundation, I mean it. If you think about our business community, healthcare, education, arts, religion, what you all have done for New Orleans and Louisiana is extraordinary. It's unmatched. And we're privileged to be a part of the network of organizations that you have supported. So with that, folks, I would ask that you give a warm welcome to Gail Benson.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for that kind introduction, Stephen, and thank you all for being here today. I am truly blessed to be in a position and have the opportunity to highlight these amazing women within the Our War II exhibit. My husband and I have supported the National World War II Museum and its mission since the days of its inception, as Steve has said. We have witnessed firsthand how much the museum means to our city. The museum is particularly special to me because my husband, Tom Benson, enlisted in the US Navy at 17 years old and served in the Pacific aboard the USS South Dakota in 1945. Tom was so very proud to serve our country and humble. And while witnessing his pride to serve and the stories he has shared with me of his time in the Navy has meant so much to me and has given me so many wonderful memories. Being able to add the Our War II exhibit to the museum will undoubtedly enhance the experience for all visitors. And I'm pleased that we are able to recognize the 350,000 women who bravely answered the call to serve our country during one of the most pivotal moments in American history. In highlighting the personal stories and motivations of these service women, the Our War II exhibit will bring to life the courage, resilience, and unwavering patriotism that drove these women to contribute to the war effort. Today, I'm confident that the Our War II exhibit will inspire us, the others, to share and inspire that when we work together and come in unity, and when we are committed towards a common goal, we too can achieve great things in everything we do to help one another to become more successful in all our works. In all we do, whether it is the New Orleans Saints, Pelicans, Benson Capital Partners, corporate realty, or our car dealerships, we all strive to embody the work ethic and unifying commitment that the World War II generation has established. Sorry. I am truly humbled to be able to help preserve the legacy of these amazing women. Thank you all for your attention and for being here this morning, and I appreciate you being here. Thank you. I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mrs. Benson. Beautifully said. And as I said, thank you for all you do, and that all the Gail and Tom Benson Charitable Foundation will continue to do for our community. So now on to the program this morning. This program is another product of a proud New Orleanian, Jenny Craig. The Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy is the driver of the educational content here at the National World War II Museum. Providing important programs like this that educate and inspire with the lessons and legacy of the war. So I'm going to hand this off to Jeremy Collins in just a second, but before I do that, I want to recognize one more person from the Jenny Craig Institute who designed this product, this program today. Her first major symposium that she has designed and produced at the National World War II Museum, a fellow proud graduate of Nicholls State University, and that is Conference Program Specialist Connie Gentry. So well done, Connie. Congratulations for putting this all together. So now it's my pleasure to hand off the program to the Jenny Craig Institute's Senior Director of Programs, Jeremy Collins, who will guide us through the day, and as he said a minute ago, chair the first session. It's all yours, Jeremy. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Stephen. Thanks to you all for being here. As Stephen and Mrs. Benson mentioned this morning, over 350,000 women served in the United States Armed Forces during World War II. And I'm proud to say one of those was a young lady named Beulah Stowe, who became Beulah Stowe Collins after she met a naval officer while she served with the Waves, and married my grandfather after the war. So this is a near and dear subject to me. One of my favorite points in walking guests around our galleries is at the beginning and end of our Arsenal of Democracy exhibit, where we have the toy soldiers. Who's been through our galleries? Raise your hand. Great. So you know the toy soldiers that represent the armed forces in 1939, with the Japanese, the Germans flanking the United States. Those United States toy soldiers represent 335,000 men in uniform in 1939. And at the end of the exhibit, we get into the chart where the women are represented with all the branches. And by the end of the war, we have more women in uniform than we had men at the beginning of the war. It's something that I think brings home the significance of what these women did. Young women, girls, I call the men boys because they really were at that age kids. The 350,000 people could represent about 20 infantry divisions, give or take. So those women that were able to take those jobs from the men allowed those men to fill the ranks on the combat and front lines. So it's a remarkable and revolutionary period in American history, and it has a long and lasting legacy that today is a part of. So as we've mentioned, it's my pleasure to also serve as chair for this first session, Giants of History, Leading American Women of World War II. This will highlight two remarkable women, Eleanor Roosevelt and Anna Rosenberg. Though both were civilians, they were known to wear various uniforms and wear different hats in service to President Franklin Roosevelt. First, we will hear from Shannon McKenna Schmidt on her book, The First Lady of World War II, Eleanor Roosevelt's Daring Journey to the Front Lines and Back. Shannon has written for National Geographic Traveler, Shelf Awareness, dailybeast.com, npr.org, and other websites and publications, including an Arrive magazine cover story featuring President Bill Clinton. From 2010 to 2017, Shannon traveled full-time, first in the United States by RV, and then backpacking around the globe. After Shannon speaks, we will hear from Christopher Gorham on his book, The Confidant, the untold story of the woman who helped win World War II and shape modern America. Christopher holds multiple degrees from the University of Michigan, Tufts University, and Syracuse College of Law. After practicing law for over a decade, he spent the last several years teaching modern American history at Westford Academy outside of Boston. His writing has appeared in the Washington Post, Literary Hub, Paper Brigade Daily, and online publications. The Confidant is his first book. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Shannon McKenna Schmidt and Christopher Gorham.
Well, thank you, Jeremy, for the lovely introduction. And thanks so much to all of you for coming today and to all those joining us online. It's terrific to be here to talk about the extraordinary Eleanor Roosevelt. The unique place that Eleanor occupied in the United States and in the world during World War II can be seen through the lens of her groundbreaking trip to the Pacific Theater. One night in August 1943, a military transport plane traveling under the code name Flight 321 left San Francisco bound for the Pacific Theater. Inside the plane, which you can see here, was bare bones, it was loud and rumbling, it was unpressurized, and it was freezing cold. On board, sharing space with supplies and sacks of mail, was First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. By the time Eleanor set out for the Pacific, she had been First Lady for a decade. She was famous for her travels, or infamous, depending on the perspective, and she constantly made headlines for them. Unlike previous First Ladies, who by tradition primarily stayed close to the White House, Eleanor created for herself a unique role that combined her love of travel with her sense of social responsibility. She crisscrossed the country giving speeches, inspecting New Deal initiatives, seeing and meeting people, and gathering information. And that information she used to exact change, either through her own means or by providing it to the president and his policy advisors. 1 year into his presidency, FDR asked Eleanor to go to Puerto Rico to investigate labor and living conditions. The fact that she took a flight over water to get there cemented her reputation as fearless and unconventional. And around that time, she was featured on the cover of this general interest magazine and declared America's most traveled First Lady. As First Lady, Eleanor averaged an astounding 40,000 miles on the road each year. And yet, even for such an experienced traveler like Eleanor, the Pacific trip exceeded anything she had previously done, including a wartime trip to Great Britain the year before. This time, she would be on the road longer than ever before, traveling farther and at a faster pace, covering more ground, enduring more discomforts, and facing danger. Eleanor was heading into a theater of war unlike any other in history, one where fighting took place across great distances over water and on islands with harsh terrain. Life magazine used these aerial views of a globe to show its readers how the Pacific Ocean sprawls across nearly half the planet, transforming the area into what they described as the vastest single battlefield over which man has ever fought. Eleanor traveled for 5 weeks and covered 25,000 miles, a distance roughly equivalent to the Earth's circumference. She went to Hawaii, Australia, New Zealand, through the South Pacific, and, at her insistence, into territory that was still under enemy air attack. Eleanor predicted that the Pacific trip would cost her deeply, both physically and mentally, and in fact, this turned out to be true. Early on in the research process for the book, I came across something that she wrote in an autobiography 6 years after her trip to the Pacific, and she said, "The Pacific trip left a mark from which I think I shall never be free." And I found that statement so powerful and haunting, and that she said it so many years later, and it really compelled me to uncover what she experienced during her time in the Pacific. So why did she do it? Why did she commit herself to such an arduous undertaking? Eleanor felt an enormous responsibility to contribute to the war effort, and she continually looked for ways to do that. To her frustration, some of the things that she wanted to do did not work out, and she was convinced that her association with the White House would prevent her from doing any real job in World War II. Then her journey to Great Britain proved differently. It was an important undertaking uniquely suited to her. She was world famous and well-renowned. She had the travel savvy, as well as the diplomatic skills, the people skills, the morale-building skills, and the reporting skills. The trip was a resounding success. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was impressed with the way that Eleanor charmed and bolstered the British people, telling her afterward, "You certainly have left golden footprints behind you." Eleanor's trip to the Pacific would draw on all those same skills, and it would require even more endurance and courage, which was exactly the kind of wartime task she wanted. Eleanor especially felt a sense of obligation toward the generation of young men being sent into battle. And a primary reason for the trip was to thank US troops herself and on behalf of the president and to build morale. And in all, she addressed more than 400,000 troops throughout her time in the Pacific. The trip was also an informal diplomatic mission to allied nations Australia and New Zealand. And Eleanor being Eleanor, she added even more onto her plate by going as a representative of the American Red Cross and inspecting the organization's facilities in the region. She packed no civilian clothing, and she wore only Red Cross uniforms during the trip, which pared down her luggage and helped her adhere to a strict luggage limit. Furthermore, the trip occurred at a crucial time in the war. By the summer of 1943, the tide was turning in the Allies' favor in Europe and the Pacific. Eleanor felt that people were overly optimistic about the war's outcome and that they were becoming dangerously complacent. There were strikes at war production factories across the country. People were complaining about food rationing and shortages. The trip would link the home front and the fighting front, reminding the nation that they could not give up on their duties until the war was won, and that any slackening in production risked the lives of the men on distant battlefields. For security reasons, the trip was kept secret for the first 10 days as Eleanor made her way from island to island through the South Pacific. Her first inspection stop was Christmas Island, where there was a US Army outpost. And she thought that Christmas Island was such a speck of land, so tiny, she thought surely a large wave must come along and wash it away. And on Christmas Island, Eleanor set the rigorous pace that she would keep throughout the trip. She went nonstop the entire 5 weeks, sleeping on army cots and rustic huts, traveling by jeep over rough terrain to reach isolated camps, and doing things like climbing a lookout tower and getting an up-close look at a tank destroyer. She visited Red Cross clubs. She dined in mess halls, getting up at dawn to breakfast with servicemen, and she walked miles and miles of hospital wards. She inspected everything from laundry rooms to artillery headquarters to a dentist tent in the Australian outback. Eleanor took every opportunity to speak with servicemen, finding out what they wanted and what they needed immediately and after the war. Not only is the First Lady in an active theater of war, she's reporting to the President and the home front while she's there. As First Lady, Eleanor achieved something else that was unique, building up an extensive network of outlets that she used to communicate with the American public, holding her famous women-only press conferences, giving speeches across the country, making radio addresses, and writing a 6-day-a-week syndicated newspaper column called My Day. The strict luggage limit I mentioned earlier, part of the reason she pared down her wardrobe by wearing the uniforms was because she lugged a heavy manual typewriter with her to the Pacific so that she could keep writing My Day in real time, and copy was wired to her editor in New York. During World War II, Eleanor used these platforms to support the war effort and to help guide the nation, from urging women to seek employment in the defense industry and the military, and helping to overcome the social stigma of doing so, to advocating for legislation to support veterans. She promoted the buying of war bonds and donating to the Red Cross Blood Bank, which was a new nationwide program at the time. The blood was turned into dried plasma and sent to the front lines, where it was kept in foxholes for use during battle. As she had been doing her entire time as First Lady, Eleanor used the knowledge she gleaned to advise on issues that might not otherwise have been known or fully understood. For example, to prepare the nation for the fact that men would be returning home with disabilities in greater numbers than ever before, she shared the story of a soldier she met on Christmas Island, whose leg was amputated after he was pinned beneath an overturned tank. Due to advances in medicine, like having blood plasma at the ready, if troops didn't die outright in battle, chances were they would live, albeit with physical disabilities. And Eleanor advised that these men be treated not with pity, but with helpfulness and understanding. Eleanor used her platforms to buoy home front morale and to admonish when necessary, such as chastising Americans for believing enemy propaganda and doing Hitler's work for him. Eleanor also used My Day to help maintain the secrecy of the Pacific trip. For the first 10 days of the trip, she had pre-written columns, and the byline listed her location as being at home in Hyde Park, New York. Eleanor continued to make her way through the South Pacific until she reached the island of New Caledonia, where she ran into a roadblock. That roadblock was Admiral William Halsey, commander of the South Pacific Forces, and the man who would decide if she was allowed to visit the island of Guadalcanal, which was her ultimate goal of the trip, and it was still on the front lines. Admiral Halsey was not pleased to have Eleanor in the Pacific. Although he liked and admired her, he didn't like VIPs traipsing through his area on what he thought were usually superficial PR junkets. When Eleanor arrived at his headquarters, Admiral Halsey brusquely shut down the suggestion of her going to Guadalcanal. He did make a slight concession, saying that he would wait to make a final decision until after she visited Australia and New Zealand and returned to New Caledonia, and he would see what the status was of a current battle he was overseeing and whether he had the fighter planes available to escort her into Guadalcanal. Eleanor was devastated at this immediate shutting down of her request, and she left for New Zealand in really low spirits because she thought, given this initial reception, there was no way that Admiral Halsey was going to agree to her going to Guadalcanal. After 10 days of secrecy, Eleanor landed in New Zealand, and news broke about the trip. There wasn't so much surprise that she turned up on the other side of the world, but that it had been such a well-kept secret. Eleanor was familiar to New Zealanders and Australians because of news coverage during her time as First Lady, and her reputation as an advocate for social justice preceded her. A New Zealand newspaper said at the time of her visit, "Mrs. Roosevelt is frequently described as the world's foremost female political force. She is the wife of a ruler, but her power comes from her influence not on him, but on public opinion. It is essentially a self-made influence. No other president's wife has exercised anything like the same power either in her own land or in the world without." Another New Zealand newspaper called Eleanor a great fighter in the cause of the world's freedom. They were particularly impressed that she was perhaps the only woman at whom Hitler screamed his denunciations. For years, Eleanor had been publicly speaking out against Hitler and Nazi aggression, and the Nazis noticed. A German newspaper threatened her by name, and Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, wrote in his diary, "Mrs. Roosevelt is shooting her mouth off around the country. If she were my wife, it would be a different story." Eleanor was a presence on the global stage during World War II. She made 3 wartime trips overseas to Great Britain, the Pacific, and a year later to the Caribbean area. She was asked to make morale-raising radio addresses to women in Sweden, Brazil, France, and other countries. She was a voice to the Allied nations, so renowned and respected that she, and what she stood for, was a threat to the Axis. Eleanor's visit to New Zealand and Australia was a historic event. She was the first US president's wife to visit, and that she traveled there during wartime made it even more impressive to them. Her visit generated a level of excitement that was on par with royalty, even blocking traffic in Sydney. And this clipping is from a scrapbook sent to Eleanor by the New Zealand government commemorating the trip. Part of the reason Eleanor had been invited to New Zealand and Australia was to see the war work that women were doing in the armed forces and factories. They were performing a greater variety of jobs than women in the United States, where the manpower shortage was less acute. Here's Eleanor at a laboratory in Wellington that performed high-precision work on optical munitions. At a Ford factory that produced grenades, mortar bombs, and other weaponry, more than 100 women paused what they were doing and spontaneously cheered when Eleanor entered their workroom. Women were employed at the Ford factory for the first time and made up the majority of employees, girls who are doing a man-sized job, according to the company. Or as Eleanor described it in my day, doing dangerous work and doing it well and with considerable skill. Eleanor highlighted to the home front the role being played by US Army and Navy nurses in the Pacific. She shared in my day that if she were young enough, she would like to have been a nurse in the Army or the Navy because they most closely shared the men's experiences. And this is Eleanor at a Red Cross club in Sydney speaking with nurses who served in New Guinea. And Eleanor told My Day readers that everyone at home owed a debt of gratitude to the nurses in the Pacific. They are not living very comfortably, she said. They are seeing daily sights that must try their fortitude, and yet she never heard a single one complain. As Eleanor traveled through New Zealand and Australia, she had a dual task: rallying people to see the war through to its conclusion and looking ahead and preparing for peace. And she had a message for women in particular. Regardless of where they found their place after the war, returning to their homes or continuing in the workforce, they needed to be involved in civic life, to use their voice and the power of their vote, and not sit idly by while men alone determine the fates of their countries. Just as women broke new ground while helping to win the war, they needed to play a greater part in the post-war era to help build and maintain a peaceful world. After leaving Australia, Eleanor went off the grid again for security reasons. She returned to Admiral Halsey's headquarters on New Caledonia, where she received some great news. She was going to Guadalcanal. Eleanor won Admiral Halsey's support not by making arguments, but by the power of her example. Through his own observations, along with reports from other military personnel and a tremendous amount of press coverage, he saw that her motivation was genuine and that this trip was no superficial PR junket. Admiral Halsey later admitted to being sorry for his original surliness, and allowing Eleanor to go to Guadalcanal was a sign of respect for her. Plus, morale wins wars, and he could see the uplifting effect that her presence had on the troops. Here is this gruff, tough admiral, and he said that what he marveled at most were the expressions on the men's faces as Eleanor leaned over them in their hospital beds. He said most people came through his area, glanced into a sun parlor at a hospital, and left. Eleanor, meanwhile, went bed to bed, comforting the wounded. And part of what made Eleanor so successful was her extraordinary ability to connect with people, whether it was the Prime Minister of New Zealand or a wounded young soldier she met at a hospital in Australia. When she reached this young man's bedside, he handed her a letter, a very long letter, and she read the entire thing. She could see that he was distressed, and she ordered everyone, medical personnel, reporters, and the high-ranking officers who insisted on following her around, to go wait in the corridor while she spoke with this young man alone. And this is one instance out of many that illustrates Eleanor's caring about the servicemen on an individual level. So Admiral Halsey was now fully on board with Eleanor's visit to Guadalcanal, and any misgivings that he still had were solely out of concern for her safety. Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands was the site of the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific War, and visiting there was a tribute that Eleanor felt she owed to the men in uniform. Her respect for the troops' sacrifices was deeply personal. All 4 of her sons were serving in various branches of the military on active duty, including her son James, a Marine who fought in the Solomon Islands campaign. In the early morning hours, under cover of darkness, Eleanor left for Guadalcanal in a heavily gunned U.S. Navy bomber, which flew with lights out to evade detection. As the bomber closed in on Guadalcanal, 6 fighter planes appeared to escort it the rest of the way. Because as it turns out, Admiral Halsey's concerns about Eleanor's safety were warranted. Guadalcanal was bombed several nights before and after her visit, leading him to speculate whether the Japanese also had code breakers. The danger associated with the trip didn't faze Eleanor. On her return home, the planned route was changed at the last minute because of reports of Japanese aircraft in the area for retaliatory raids. Eleanor had courage in spades, and as I said, the danger didn't concern her. What greatly impacted her was the massive scale of suffering she witnessed. She said that one sees the results of the war in the hospitals. Eleanor was a class act when she was going through the hospital wards, bed to bed, offering words of comfort or a joke. But she said that inside she was burning with resentment at what was being done to these young men. And Eleanor was extremely forthright when reporting back to the American public and making them understand the human cost of the war. In a radio address after her return from the Pacific, she told of a young man she met in a first-line hospital, so recently injured that he was still in the set of bandages from when he fell in battle. She told people to stop complaining about food rationing and shortages because it was nothing compared to lying on your back in a jungle swamp while an enemy camouflaged in the trees took shots at you. In another speech, she recalled the shadowed eyes of the men who had endured the savagery of jungle warfare. Eleanor went to great lengths to understand jungle warfare, which was a new type of fighting for American servicemen. She had a reputation for wanting to see things for herself, and that's exactly what she did, even trekking through the jungle on a training exercise. She wished she had seen the training before answering a letter she received from a serviceman's mother, and this woman was outraged that her son was being trained in the Louisiana swamps, which she thought was cruel and unnecessary. And Eleanor said, I might have been able to explain to her that it was for her son's own safety in the future. Eleanor's final stop in the Pacific was Honolulu. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, she was the first public figure to address the nation. She was scheduled to broadcast her weekly radio show that same evening, and she went on the air as planned, offering an encouraging message to the American people. This is Eleanor on the battleship USS Oklahoma, which was torpedoed and sank at Pearl Harbor, taking 429 sailors down with her. At the time of Eleanor's visit, the Oklahoma had been raised from the harbor floor, and it was being held upright with cables, but it was not yet afloat. As Eleanor predicted, the trip took a huge physical and emotional toll on her. She lost 30 pounds while she was overseas, and after she came home, she fell into a deep depression. A close friend of hers explained it by saying, as long as she had to keep going, her iron will carried her through in spite of her deep horror at what she saw and the great sadness at the continued bloodshed and dying. As Time magazine pointed out, no other U.S. mother had seen so much of the panorama of the war, had been closer to the sweat and boredom, the suffering. And yet the Pacific trip made Eleanor determined to work even harder, to see the war through and to strive for peace so that this carnage never happened again. A near-term goal was to see a support program established for returning servicemen. Eleanor used the power of her public platform to help ensure that this was done, bringing pressure to bear on Congress. And the GI Bill of Rights was signed into law the next year. One of the most telling instances about the validity of Eleanor's trip to the Pacific was Admiral Halsey completely changing his mind about her being there, and he was not inclined to change his mind easily. He said, she alone accomplished more good than any other person or any group of civilians who passed through my area. Among Eleanor's biggest supporters were the soldiers on Christmas Island. When controversy erupted over the trip, they took on her detractors in their troop publication. A GI journalist reported, "Her kindness and consideration brought this island of forgotten men very much back to life." Another said, "It takes great courage to do what Mrs. Roosevelt is now doing, and you have to hand it to her. She has what it takes." The Pacific trip exemplifies so much of what is admired about Eleanor Roosevelt: her courage, her compassion, her connections with people, her crusading for a better world. And it shows how important her leadership was during World War II. A reporter at the time described Eleanor's trip to the Pacific, and I believe this still stands, as the most remarkable journey any president's wife has ever made. Thank you for listening. Again, thank you so much, and I look forward to our Q&A session after Christopher's presentation.
Thank you, Shannon. We will have Christopher, and as Shannon just indicated, we will have a little bit of a roundtable conversation before we throw it to the floor for audience Q&A.
I want to thank the the Benson family, Stephen, Jeremy, Connie, Kim, and also Shannon for that wonderful talk. Thank you all for being here. Anna and her family had to leave Budapest. Like thousands of other Jewish families, they were driven from Eastern Europe. Anna's father, a successful businessman there in the white hat, was essentially ruined by the caprice of Emperor Franz Joseph of Austro-Hungarian Empire. Albert supplied furnishings for his palaces, and the monarch broke the contract, and after which Albert sailed for New York. 2 years later, his daughters and his wife were able to join him. And in those 2 years, Albert had become a fiercely patriotic American, and he instilled in his daughter the values that he was learning in his adopted country. By age 17, Anna, here in the foreground, was engaged in the two largest events of the day. One was, of course, women's suffrage, and the other was America's entry into World War I in 1917. Here, she and her sister have volunteered as Red Cross nurses. Anna also found herself in the pages of the New York Times as a 17-year-old for mediating a student strike. She would be in the pages of that newspaper for the next 7 decades. In 1919, right after World War I, Anna married her husband, Mike Rosenberg, and the couple had a son in 1920 named Thomas. Now, Anna didn't go to college, but she had two very important teachers in her early life. One was Belle Moskowitz on the left, who taught her how women could exercise power from behind the scenes. And her political father, if you will, was a tough district leader of Tammany Hall who taught her the retail politics of New York City, how to knock on thousands of doors, make thousands of phone calls to get your issue acted upon. With this, Anna Rosenberg, who always made time for politics, in addition to her labor mediation business, which she'd opened, with this, Anna Rosenberg, here on the right, became one of the first women in American history to manage political campaigns, and not just aldermen, and not just in Albany, but U.S. Congress campaigns. Here, her candidate, of course, Theodore Pizer, won. Now, we don't know what she's saying to these women. Perhaps it was something along the lines of, women, we now have the right to vote. Let's go out and get our issues acted upon and our candidates elected. One media outlet called this young mother, young businesswoman, and a young woman who always made time for politics, one media outlet called her the busiest woman in New York. But the most important person that she would ever meet in her life was the woman we just heard about, the great Eleanor Roosevelt. In 1928, Anna, who always made time for politics, went to a Democratic tea hosted by Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor meets her and says, "Young lady, what do you do for a living?" Anna says, "Well, I have a labor mediation office. I am engaged in politics." And Eleanor said, "Well, I'd like you to meet my husband. He's running for governor of New York." And days later, Anna Rosenberg found herself on the steps of the Roosevelt townhouse in New York. And after that, she became part of that gubernatorial team. The team that Roosevelt put together did something that no other governor was doing. It conjured up an energetic response to the catastrophe of the Great Depression. And this made Franklin Roosevelt the leading candidate in 1932. He won that race in 1932 for president, and he needed to have officers in his New Deal Army. And he remembered Anna Rosenberg, so he asked her to be, in fact, made her the only woman regional director of not one, but two massive New Deal programs, the second of which was Social Security. Now, this was Roosevelt's home state. He needed this stuff to work in New York if he was going to argue to Wyoming or Iowa that this needed to be part of the new regime. Anna Rosenberg, without going to college, without opening a law book, signed up 6 million New Yorkers to Social Security. Elderly women would say to her, "I can't tell you my real age because my husband doesn't know my real age." And she would say, "Uncle Sam and I will keep your secrets." In 1941, with World War II, America's entry into World War II on the horizon, this is 6 months before Pearl Harbor. The president knew that war was coming. The defense industry certainly did, because they were making the tanks and the planes and the equipment for our allies and for the American armed forces. The problem was that these good-paying jobs were only being given to white Americans. The black leader of the day, a man named A. Philip Randolph, said to the White House, "I will march for equality, and I will bring tens of thousands of marchers with me." Now, Eleanor Roosevelt was sympathetic with this, but the president was in a tremendous bind because the Southern lawmakers he knew would grant no concessions toward this, and he needed their support for the war effort. He enlisted an ace mediator that he knew, Anna Rosenberg, and he ordered her over 2 weeks in the summer of 1941 to be at every single meeting in Washington and New York to try and come up with a solution that would satisfy the White House and the black leadership. Over 2 weeks, when it looked like the impasse would not be broken, Anna finally had a draft executive order in her handbag, and she was all she needed to do was get the president to sign it. And this is where Eleanor comes in again. Eleanor said, "Now, Anna, I want you to go to the boutiques of Georgetown, buy yourself one of those fancy hats that you love so much, get up to confidence, and come back and get the boss to sign it." And that's what she did. When she returned to the White House, she took out the draft executive order, spread it on his desk, and he listened. She said, "Sign it, Mr. President, sign it," and he listened. Historians say the Executive Order 8802, mandating equality in defense hiring, was the first federal action on civil rights since Reconstruction. By 1942, the president was calling Anna Rosenberg his Mrs. Fix-It in the newspapers. Now, when we think of the sort of mid-war and the arsenal of democracy, I think there's a tendency to think of it as like America flipping on a light switch, and Chrysler was building tanks and Ford was building planes and everything was working well. It's not quite that easy. There was a dire labor situation. There was worker piracy. There was a surplus of workers in places like New York and too few workers in places like Portland, Oregon. There was absenteeism, there was alcoholism, and there was lack of child care for women workers. One of the hardest hit areas was Buffalo, New York. They built everything: tanks, planes, parachutes, medicine for the Allies and for the Americans. And they were short nearly 100,000 workers. So Mrs. Fix-It, Anna Rosenberg, was sent by the president to become essentially the labor czar of Buffalo, and he said, "Fix it." She gets to Buffalo, she realizes that more women are needed, but not just single women, women with children, married women, even grandmothers needed to put on the bandana and get to work. But they needed to have child care, which Buffalo hadn't thought of. So she established the child care. She had the theaters open 24/7. She had the parks heated and open day and night. She had places for them, the women, to cash their checks safely instead of having to go to the tavern at 3 or 4 in the morning. Women in great numbers took these jobs. They punched in and they punched back. One of the magazines, in fact, Time called it the Rosenberg Plan, this labor program that Anna had developed in Buffalo. Other outlets called it the Buffalo Plan. Part of the Buffalo Plan was to get surplus workers where they were needed most. And this meant New Yorkers crossing the country to places like Portland, Oregon, to the dockyards. Under a program that was developed by Anna Rosenberg, thousands of New Yorkers signed up for these jobs. They got on the trains and they started making their way to Portland, Oregon. But she found out thereafter that the black New Yorkers were only being given menial jobs as porters and painters. Anna stopped the trains in their tracks. She summoned the labor union and the management to New York, and she sorted them out. Afterwards, she said, this is no time for disunity. The trains resumed thereafter, and the arsenal of democracy was allowed to fire on full bore, at full bore. I know reading from a nonfiction is not always everybody's favorite thing, but I'll read just a short bit here. How did the Rosenberg or the Buffalo Plan work once the workers were where they were needed most? It worked like this. The Liberty ships, these big transport ships that ferried equipment across the Atlantic, the first one took 131 days to build. Once the New Yorkers were on the docks, the keel of the Robert E. Peary was laid on a Sunday. It set sail 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes later. A woman was there to christen the ship, arrived too late. A dock worker said, "Just keep standing there, ma'am. There'll be another one along in a minute." One of the missions of the Institute here is to show how World War II and American democracy were linked. And I want to share with you a story of Anna's career. She was touring, and this is very, very much like something Eleanor Roosevelt, we could see Eleanor Roosevelt doing. She toured a arms factory. There was a young woman worker there at a machine punching out these little tiny screws. The look on the woman's face, the young woman's face, was one of boredom. This was mundane, this was monotonous. Anna took her and linked arms with her and walked her along the factory to find out what it was that she was making. It turns out that those little tiny screws were part of the bomber sight for the sophisticated bombers that were helping win the war. Anna said the look on the young woman's face changed immediately. She was helping defeat the enemy. President Roosevelt had been sent to, Franklin Roosevelt, when he was a young man, had been sent by President Wilson to World War I to check on the doughboys of that war. And when it was his turn in 1944 to do the same thing, not only did he send his wife around for 25,000 miles, as Shannon described, but he also chose Anna Rosenberg to be a personal emissary to the battle zones of Europe. Anna Rosenberg was sent to Nazi-occupied France so soon after D-Day that the Army hadn't yet broken out of the hedgerow country. Her mission from the president was to find out from the GIs themselves what they dreamed of, what they hoped for should they be lucky enough to return. Over 6 weeks following Patton's Third Army across France as they liberated city, town, and village, she talked to these men, sharing rations off the hood of a Jeep as they pulled their pictures of their sweethearts out of their helmets. In notebook after notebook, she wrote down what these men were saying. And what they were saying was a surprise to her, as it would indeed surprise the president. What they wanted was a college education. Sure, they wanted job training when they got home. Sure, they wanted dancing lessons when they got home. But more than that, they wanted a piece of the America they were trying to help save. They wanted a college education. When she arrived back in Washington after 6 weeks, President Roosevelt summoned her for a debriefing. She said, "When I told the president this, his face lit up." And thereafter, from 1946-47, the items that were grafted onto the Servicemen's Readjustment Act were almost all educational in nature. The GI Bill was not perfect, but it transformed post-war America by elevating millions into the middle class. Now, many of you, all of you, will recognize this man here. This is, of course, George S. Patton. There weren't too many people that I can think of that referred to him as Georgie, but Anna Rosenberg was one of them. She was very fond of the general. The general was very fond of her. In fact, she got along quite well with Omar Bradley, Walter Bedell Smith, and indeed Dwight Eisenhower. But George Patton's dog was not such a fan. His dog bit Anna on the backside when she arrived at his forward command post. The last lunch that Franklin Roosevelt ever ate at the White House, this is about 2 weeks before he died, he was leaving by train for Georgia. The last lunch he ever ate at the White House was a one-on-one with Anna Rosenberg. He was sending her back to Europe to deal with the demobilization, to continue her work with the demobilizing troops. By the time she arrived in Europe, of course, Roosevelt was dead. President Truman was in charge. And by the time she arrived in Europe, her mission, of course, had to change almost immediately because General Eisenhower had liberated the first concentration camps on the Western Front. Eisenhower, when he did this, was aghast. He cabled Washington, send congressmen, send journalists to bear witness to these atrocities. Of course, Anna Rosenberg was already in the country, so she was flown to the Nordhausen concentration camp only days after its liberation. So soon after its liberation that prisoners were still in their ragged, striped uniforms. She climbed out of a Jeep wearing her WWII uniform into a hellish scene. She always carried a woman's purse and a man's briefcase with her. And as she climbed out of the Jeep, women prisoners approached her. She said they could barely stand erect. She reached into her purse. What can I possibly give them? I don't have food, medicine, water. She reached into her purse, gave a lipstick to one, a compact to another. She reached into her briefcase, gave pencils and notepaper to others. She spoke, I only found one time, but very profoundly about the insufficiency of this gesture. But also, she mentioned the look on the women's faces. Something had been given back to them after everything had been taken from them, even their very names. In October of 1945, Anna Rosenberg became the first man or woman to be awarded the Medal of Freedom for civilians who had helped defeat the enemy in war. You can see the tremendous pride on her face. Anna did, a close advisor to President Truman, which is very interesting. Usually the confidant relationship, when the president or the emperor or the general goes off the stage of history, so does the confidant. That was not the case for Anna Rosenberg. She remained a very trusted advisor to the next president, President Truman. In fact, she became the top woman in the Truman administration. The year was 1950, 5 years after the end of World War II, but a new war was on the horizon. That was the Korean War. Anna was back in New York. She was back with her husband. She was back with her son, who served in World War II and was newly married. She'd finally bought the apartment that she'd rented for decades. Life was good in 1950 for Anna Rosenberg until she opened up a piece of mail on stationery of the Secretary of Defense. The letter began, "Dear Anna, will you consider an appointment as Assistant Secretary of Defense?" Signed, George C. Marshall. Now, Anna knew she could not say no to the general. She venerated the man, the architect of victory in World War II. But she also had to be honest. She said to the general, "I wear the bullseye. I'm Jewish. I'm from Eastern Europe. I speak with an accent. I'm pro-union. I'm a New Dealer. They're going to come after me, General, and they're going to come after you." To the general's credit, he said, "We'll stick together. We'll stick through this." And so she began in November of 1950 to work at the Pentagon. The only thing that was required was the full Senate confirmatory vote. It's at this moment that Senator Joe McCarthy enters the picture. He didn't want Anna Rosenberg to be at the Pentagon. So what he did, even though he wasn't on the Senate Armed Services Committee, is he pulled strings in the Senate to delay the full Senate vote by 2 weeks. And in that 2 weeks, he conjured up an ugly smear campaign that would try and paint Anna Rosenberg as a traitor to her country, as a disloyal American. The plan hinged on the testimony of a man named Ralph DeSola, who would take the train down from New York and testify that he'd seen Anna Rosenberg at a communist cell meeting in 1930s. The Senate Armed Services Committee reopened the hearings. This story was carried on all the networks, all the newspapers in December of 1950, and indeed across the country. Ralph DeSola and Anna Rosenberg came face to face, and the man's testimony went up in smoke. It was obvious to the senators, it was obvious to everyone that he was lying. In fact, Anna had done her homework. She always brought the receipts. She had a New York City phone book. Do you know how many Anna Rosenbergs were in the New York City phone book? There were 47. In fact, J. Edgar Hoover found the real the communist Anna Rosenberg out in California. This Anna Rosenberg was a lifelong patriot, and she emerged from the McCarthyist smear with her career and her integrity intact. She served 26 months at the Pentagon as the Assistant Secretary of Defense, a civilian woman at the very highest echelons of the American military establishment. And like she'd done in World War II, she made 2 trips to the battlefields of Korea. And again, like Eleanor Roosevelt and like she'd done in World War II, she did not go as a VIP. She was there to find out from the men themselves what it was like, the men and women, because there were women in Korea, what it was like to be serving their country. Here you see her with integrated troops. When she first arrived in Korea, a journalist said, "How many black troops are serving in Korea?" She said, "That's not the question. The question is how many American troops are serving in Korea." Like Eleanor Roosevelt would have done, she lifted up the lid on the soup pot. She opened up the footlocker. She pulled the curtain back to make sure that the things for the GIs were as they should be and that they wanted for nothing. You can see the tremendous look of pride on her face. What the men were doing to keep our country safe was always at the foremost of her thoughts. When journalists would come talk to her, it was never about her. It was never an opportunity to trumpet her own career, it was always about the commander-in-chief and the men and women who were keeping us safe. Senator Lyndon Johnson's job was to keep the armed forces budget in check, and Anna Rosenberg's job was to make sure that they had increased combat pay, and their families were having more provisions while they were away protecting the country. Although they're eyeball to eyeball in this picture, these two are tremendous friends for about 30, 35 years. In 1959, Edward R. Murrow, the legendary journalist, had Anna Rosenberg on his TV program, and he asked her about the sexism that she would have faced in the Pentagon as a woman, about reaching the highest echelons of American power in the military, in business, and in politics. He asked her, too, about her china collection and her hat collection. And he asked her about those heroic days with Franklin Roosevelt in World War II. And at the end of it, he said, "Anna, you have quite a book to write someday." And she said, "Ed, that's a book that will never be written." But 40 years after her death in 1983, we're here together learning about the remarkable career of Anna Rosenberg, who helped America be victorious in war and prosperous in peace. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to Shannon and Christopher. I've got a few questions for each of them and for both of them. I'm going to start with a joint question. Shannon, this subject of Eleanor is pretty well known. She's had a lot written about her, but not specifically this trip. So what was it that inspired you? What piqued your interest on this particular aspect? And what were 1, 2, 3 primary sources? What were the key archives that you had that were able to, allowed you to peel back the curtains on this story, please?
Yeah, well, Eleanor Roosevelt lived such a full, rich, accomplished life that I think this 5-week period gets overshadowed within the larger scope of her life, and yet it had such a tremendous impact on her. That quote that I mentioned, that the Pacific trip left a mark from which I think I shall never be free, was a powerful motivator for me to uncover this. And I came up with the idea because I was reading a collection of my day, actually, and I came across a mention that Eleanor visited Australia during a tour of the Pacific Theater. Fleeting mention, but it immediately piqued my interest because I had recently been to Australia and New Zealand. And the first thought that struck me was amazement at the distance that Eleanor would have traveled to get there, and under wartime conditions. And from there, it really spiraled. I really connected with Eleanor Roosevelt, the traveler, the adventurer, and it's hard for me to overstate the impact that her being a traveler had on her being considered an unconventional first lady. The Literary Digest that I showed, the accompanying article said that the nation watched with mingled admiration and alarm as Eleanor darted about because they just weren't used to their first ladies doing this. And fortunately for me, Eleanor, there's a wealth of, I was able to use a lot of Eleanor's own words. My day. She kept a diary while she was in the South Pacific. She gave speeches after she got back. She wrote articles. And so really the heart of the book comes from the Eleanor Roosevelt papers at the FDR Presidential Library and Museum, not to downplay all of the other important things as well, like soldiers, servicemen's reminiscences, and Red Cross workers and nurses as well.
Christopher, can you enlighten us? You mentioned 40 years after her death. We're here talking about her. She's referenced, Anna is referenced in many biographies, some autobiographies and memoirs, but not a one volume on her own. Why is that? Why you?
Well, it's a great question. She, as I suggested, was not one to trumpet her own career. Clearly, she loved to have the journalist come. She always dressed up and liked to have her photo taken. But when you read what she's saying, it was never about her. It was always about the commander-in-chief or the service members that were then serving the country. But there are other reasons. I also mentioned she didn't have a college education, let alone from an elite university. So you think about Frances Perkins, you know, she has Penn or Columbia to keep her memory lit, but Anna Rosenberg has no such college to do that. Another reason was the telephone had supplanted the pen. For Anna Rosenberg to do all the things that she did for Presidents Roosevelt and Truman, she was on the telephone. She had to be efficient. She said herself, I issue not very memos, not too many memos. I don't do 8 carbons. When I want something done, I get on the telephone, I get it done. And of course, there's the unfortunate coincidence of surname. Rosenberg, of course, was the last name of the atomic spies picked up in New York by the FBI in 1950. So Anna's natural disinclination to trumpet her own career was really doubled down. No less than Eleanor Roosevelt tried to put her in touch with a biographer. And Anna's letters to Eleanor were always very, very sweet, but her response in this case was kind of terse. She said, I'm not interested in that. Henry Luce, the founder of Time and Life, wanted her memoirs, as did many publishing houses in New York City. No, no, and no. She just wasn't interested. And lastly, Jeremy, I think it's who she was. You know, she had met with Roosevelt perhaps 150 times one-on-one. That's more than most cabinet members. And what she was told in those meetings, she wanted to not be, within the covers of a book. You know, she was the confidant, first, last, and always.
You just touched on it, Christopher. My next question was going to be about the relationship. It's Eleanor who suggests that Anna reach out to Franklin. But can you two, I'll lean back so you can talk to each other. Can you talk about their relationship with each other, either personal or official, wartime or post-war?
Well, I'll just start briefly and then pass it over to Christopher. But when I was reading Christopher's book, I was just struck by how very alike Eleanor Roosevelt and Anna Rosenberg really were. Their values, their vision, the way that they, even with their wartime trips, how they cared about the servicemen, and enormously driven to contribute to the war effort in World War II.
Yeah, it was perhaps my favorite box of research was the letters between the two women. Anna Rosenberg just admired, how could you not, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Eleanor, taught her and demonstrated to her through her actions, really how one ought to be in World War II in these crises, these American crises. One of the wonderful things that I came across was the letters tended to get warmer over time. So, and they were writing letters to each other since 1928. So you get to 1942, and they've been corresponding for a long time, but the letters are always Mrs. Roosevelt, Mrs. Rosenberg, very formal. In 1942, that changes. Anna sent Eleanor Roosevelt a letter that she'd received from one of her staffers who'd been reassigned to go out to a camp in Idaho for interned Japanese Americans. And this young staffer wrote a letter back to Anna Rosenberg saying, this is not who we are, this is wrong. And Anna put that letter together with her own letter, sent it to Eleanor Roosevelt at the White House for her to read. Now, Eleanor read it, and as Shannon, of course, and many of you know, Eleanor would then have a basket for the president. And there's even a stamp on this letter that says, seen by the White House. So there's a chance that Franklin Roosevelt also saw this letter. But the important thing that I learned was thereafter, every letter that Eleanor Roosevelt ever wrote to Anna Rosenberg after that was, Dear Anna.
The issue of these two very powerful, one in front of the stage, one behind the screen, women, what about resentment? Were there first ladies that saw her doing this? Was Mrs. Churchill resentful that Eleanor was out there out front? And then for Christopher with Anna, how did the men who were confidants or consiglieres to FDR or men in position of power say, what was their thought on this high-ranking Jewish woman?
Well, Eleanor was well regarded in the world at this time. The people who didn't like her were the Japanese, the Nazis, and the Republicans in the United States, the people who didn't like the FDR administration. And of course, we still have the traditionalists at the time she goes to the Pacific, lamenting not having a more traditional first lady who knew her proper place to stay at home in the White House. So she had plenty of detractors, but they were rather trivial. The Pacific trip, of course, generated a lot of controversy. Everything that Eleanor did generated controversy. We have Congress people ranting on the floor of the House of Representatives about her being in the Pacific, things like that. But, she actually wrote an article a year later in 1944, and it was titled How to Take Criticism, and it was published in a women's magazine. And basically, and these are her words, she said, "You're damned if you do and damned if you don't. So you may as well do what you think is right and what you believe in."
Sometimes I describe to audiences the sexism that and anti-Semitism that Anna Rosenberg would have faced and did face, and I say, she was tough as a $2 steak. And you could say the same thing about the First Lady, about Eleanor Roosevelt. I mean, they had a very thick skin, ability to, and you had to know that they felt it. They felt the wounds, the slings and arrows, but they were able to not let that get in the way. Eleanor Roosevelt knew both Frances Perkins and Anna Rosenberg very well. And one of the criticisms that Anna got was actually from Secretary Perkins, because Franklin Roosevelt had put them on parallel tracks to go and solve problems, vexing problems during the war, which was a very Rooseveltian thing to do. But of course, as Eleanor Roosevelt writes about in her book, Women of Courage, Ladies of Courage, Frances Perkins was not always great at this. The fishbowl of Washington was not where she was successful, although obviously her wish list became the New Deal. Now, Anna Rosenberg, with her PR background, was able to navigate Washington with greater, it was much easier for her to navigate Washington and to solve these problems for the president. So I guess sometimes the very cabinet members that she was almost serving in her unofficial capacity were kind of pushing back against her because of that tremendous access that she had with the president.
We're going to throw it to the floor. I've got a few more questions, so I may take chair's prerogative and steal it back. But Connie, if you can go to any hands you see raised.
We'll be right here in the center.
So, looking at some of the outfits we saw both of the women wear, Eleanor Roosevelt chose to wear the Red Cross uniform, and Anna Rosenberg is in uniforms that we see war correspondents wearing, using bits and pieces that WACs and the Army nurses would have worn and bits and pieces of male uniforms. How do you think that ties back to the concept of fashion and dress as a way of expressing identity, and how it shows the similarities or differences between the two women?
Well, I can talk a little bit more about why Eleanor chose to wear the Red Cross uniform. She was a very practical traveler, so as I mentioned, that helped her pare down her clothing. So there was a very strict luggage limit, and she's going to adhere to it, just like anybody else would have to travel on these transport planes. But also, she felt that would be a reassuring sight to the servicemen that she was meeting in hospitals, and also that it would armor her with another layer of validity for being in the Pacific. Because, she is aware of this criticism. She doesn't let her hold her back, but she knows that she is going to be criticized for this trip. And it was actually the head of the American Red Cross, when the trip was decided on, she went to him and said, "I would like to inspect the facilities in the region." And he said, "Great. I was planning to send somebody anyway. I would love to have you do this." And she submitted a 9-page report after she came back to him. And he's the one who actually invited her to wear the uniform. And I think that it connected her with the troops that she was meeting. She's wearing a uniform. She's traveling like they are on a transport plane. And so I think the uniform very much helped her make connections like that while she was in the Pacific.
And unlike Eleanor, who it just wasn't really her style, but Anna would accessorize her military outfit with a silk scarf, which I think is kind of not military issue, right? And I think she Anna Rosenberg probably thought that those paratrooper boots were pretty fetching. So she was maybe viewed the uniform a little bit differently. But more often, the uniform that she wore was a dress, a hat. She wore bangles, these bracelets. She was kind of known for them. And I would wonder, I say this with kind of thinking about Colonel Cummings, if this was your experience, but when Anna Rosenberg was at the Pentagon wearing, she was basically wearing a civilian outfit. She was a woman, but the admirals and generals would smell the French perfume, and they'd hear the heels on the corridor floor, and they'd hear those bangles, and they'd shut the doors because they didn't want to work as hard. They didn't want to work till 9 o'clock at night.
Next question will be in the back left.
First of all, thank you so much for 2 really amazing presentations. They were terrific. And I have questions for both of you about the men in their lives. And to what extent, for Eleanor, was this a sanctioned trip from Franklin? Was he fully behind it? Did he support it? Or is this something she chooses to do on her own, and it's an independent action? And then for Anna, how is her relationship with her husband through this entire career that she spends working for the White House and then for the Pentagon?
Well, so Franklin Roosevelt was super supportive of Eleanor's travels from even back preceding their White House days. And when you think about it, it's kind of extraordinary because here's this woman traveling alone without her husband. So he was always on board with her travels, and as I mentioned, he did benefit from them politically. They decided together that she would visit the Pacific. And one thing that I love is that travel really became a touchstone for them in their relationship. And after she went on her travels, they would meet together, usually alone, and discuss what she had found. And there's a lot been said about the relationship. Of course, there was a lot of hurt over the years. They're even a little more distant now that the war is taking a lot of his focus. And I found that in their correspondence, they cabled each other every few days while Eleanor was in the Pacific. And there was just, you can see the love and affection that's there. They're checking on each other's health. They're exchanging news about family members. And they're making plans to see each other as soon as she returns. And it took on an extra layer of poignancy because, of course, we know that he's going to pass away in about a year and a half. And when Eleanor went to England, she was there a month. And then FDR was like, could you send her home? And when she was on a military plane coming back into Washington, D.C., and she could see the hoopla down on the tarmac with, Secret Service, and she knew that Franklin had taken time out of his busy schedule to come meet her at the airport. So he was always enormously supportive of her travels.
And in Anna Rosenberg's case, she had a very unconventional first marriage with her husband, Mike. Mike had been in World War I, and there's not a lot of evidence about him, but the evidence that is out there suggests that what he saw in the trenches really was something that was very difficult for him to shake. And they obviously weren't using PTSD at the time or recognizing it as such. He was uninterested really in her life in Washington. I've found only one instance where he was in Washington with her, and it was essentially as her driver. So very unconventional. She's the breadwinner. She's the one in Time magazine and in Life magazine and in the newspapers. So a very, very unconventional relationship in some ways. In terms of what he might have seen and the unseen scars that he might have brought back after the war, Anna Rosenberg, during World War II, she had seen herself with her own eyes what the men had seen: dead enemy, dead Americans, widows, orphans. And she would like to have seen more psychological counseling or investment attached to the GI Bill, but there was pushback at that time, and she was in fact teased and criticized in the newspapers. But her commitment to veterans, maybe even linked with the experience of her husband, a veteran, and her son, a veteran, led her to head up the Veterans Affairs Office in New York City after World War II.
Christopher, you had a photo of Anna in Korea. with the desegregated troops. Can you tell us what role she played with the Truman administration for that executive order?
Very courageous executive order, Jeremy, as you know. Truman did not have the congressional support to desegregate the armed forces, so he needed to do he had to do it by executive order, which required tremendous courage because he knew there was going to be tremendous backlash against that. Before he did that, he put together a commission with Truman Gibson, the only black member of that commission, Anna Rosenberg, and one of FDR's former speechwriters, put together a report for me that will give me some ammunition to take this executive order. And what Anna Rosenberg did was contribute to that report by, again, bringing the receipts, doing the homework. Anna found that integrated units had better combat efficiency because, of course, the all African-American units were often led by a white commander, but the worst of the white commanders. And so these units weren't fighting very well. So the integrated troops were going to be better for national security. And that allowed, in part, Truman to take that very courageous action, to say this is not only good morally, which they both agreed upon, Truman and Anna Rosenberg, but also in the interest of national security.
And Shannon, I have sort of blending of the two. On this 5-week journey, did Eleanor have a confidant? Was there an entourage? Obviously, there was security, military-wise, but who was her confidant? What was her team with her, or was she on her own?
She was on her own, and that's another thing that made the trip rather arduous for Eleanor, is that this was the first time she was traveling without. Usually, she would have her personal secretary, she was also her friend and traveling companion, Malvina Thompson, with her. Tommy Thompson did not go with Eleanor because Eleanor was hoping to cut down on the criticism by only taking one seat on the transport plane. And afterwards, she's like, well, I should have taken Tommy anyway because I got all the criticism. So that was another thing that made these 5 weeks, she started to feel very isolated. And just like for the troops, mail took a while to catch up to them, her mail sometimes took a while to catch up with her. So she did start to feel rather isolated from her loved ones. So she didn't really have a confidant on this trip. You know, she was assigned a military PR person, and she traveled with the same crew. She traveled on the same transport plane that left San Francisco, ended up returning her to New York. So she did travel with that same crew the whole time.
Next question will be in the front.
Thank you. So I have a question about like the physical security of these two women. So I'm thinking of Miss Rosenberg as like a Jewish woman, and I'm wondering if the Nazi regime would perhaps underestimate her because of that, or if she would be more heavily targeted because of that. And then also Ms. Shannon mentioned that obviously there were security concerns with Ms. Roosevelt. So I was wondering if you could touch a little bit more on that as well.
When Anna Rosenberg was in Europe in 1944 at the command post of General Patton, she was in fact pinned down by German sniper fire. So again, this is not there as a VIP, having the soldiers stand at attention. This was very much in an active combat zone, and she saw obviously the things that they would have seen and faced some of the dangers, not all of the dangers, of course, but some of the dangers. But in terms of safety and underestimation, I want to also say that when Anna Rosenberg was smeared by Senator McCarthy in 1950, there were obviously critics coming out of the woodwork against her, and it was anti-Semitism masquerading as anti-communism. But in Anna Rosenberg's case, she had a stack of letters from notable Americans in business and politics and in the military who were not just Democrat. They were Democrat, they were Republican, they were, Dwight Eisenhower, Nelson Rockefeller. So to the extent she was insulated from criticism or from smears, it was partly because she counted among people that admired her, people across the political spectrum.
Well, Eleanor was actually really annoyed in Australia because she had just all these high-ranking officers, Army officers, insisted on following her around everywhere. And she just wanted to be left alone to do her thing. And she was used to traveling unimpeded in the United States. She won a showdown with the Secret Service not to have their protection. They did insist that she keep a gun in her glove box, and she learned how to use it and everything. So she was a little bit annoyed in Australia. And there were dangers in the Pacific Theater, not just on the battlefield. For her, traveling in a military transport plane for 5 weeks was super risky because they weren't the most reliable aircraft. To save time, the military didn't design transport planes from scratch. They modified the heavy bombers. And one pilot bluntly described this bomber to transport conversion as an evil bastard contraption. So that alone, even doing that for 5 weeks was risky. And she always downplayed the danger. But she really she didn't want the pomp and ceremony in New Zealand and Australia. In particular, Australia is where it was happening. And so I just love that about her. And when she went to England, an American reporter wrote in a London newspaper, the best thing to do with Eleanor is just turn her loose. Go through the necessary formalities and then just turn her loose. She can be depended upon to see everybody there is to see and everybody worth meeting. And she really wished that they had done that in Australia. And of course, Eleanor being Eleanor, she downplayed the danger. She was giving a speech when she came back, and she's like, "Oh, it was no more risky than staying here at home." And it's like, so she really was unfazed by the danger, but what she was doing was risky.
We have another question in the back left.
Good morning. I was just wondering if y'all's books are available for purchase in the gift shop, and if so, would you sign them for me?
Now, is this a plan?
Absolutely.
Thank you. The break is coming up right about now, and in my closing remarks, first, please join me in a round of applause for Shannon and Christopher. A great start with these two great women for what's going to be a great day. We have our retail set up right outside on the Solomon Victory Theater lobby. So if you exit, you will find Christopher and Shannon sitting right there, as you will find throughout the day with our speakers. We will take our first break and get back for the second session beginning at 10:30. But I want to thank you all, and I want to thank Christopher and Shannon and Anna and Eleanor.